The gray silk of her cheongsam caught the lamplight as Mei Lin Chen smoothed it over her knees for the third time in 10 minutes, and the sound of the fabric against the wooden bench was the only company she had left in the corner of the Silver Spur Saloon in Whitfield, Kansas, in the summer of 1881. She had $5 folded into a handkerchief tucked inside her sleeve, money she had set aside from 3 months of laundry work, enough for a decent supper and perhaps a slice of pie if the evening went well. It was not going well. The letter from Mr. Bertram Voss had promised he would meet her at 7 o'clock sharp, that he would be wearing a brown coat and carrying a copy of the Whitfield Gazette folded under his arm so she would know him among the crowd. The clock above the bar, a brass thing that ticked loud enough to be heard over the piano, now read 8:30. Mei Lin did not cry. She had learned, in the 2 years since her husband died of the fever that swept through the rail camp outside Dodge City, that crying accomplished nothing a person could not accomplish better with silence and a clear head. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the door, and told herself that men were sometimes delayed by weather or business, though the sky outside had been clear all day and the roads into town were dry as bone. At the next table, close enough that she could hear the creak of his chair each time he shifted his weight, sat a rancher named Silas Whitcomb, a man whose hands were rough enough to tell his profession before anyone spoke a word about it. He had come into town that afternoon to sell 4 head of cattle, and had stayed longer than he intended, nursing a glass of whiskey he had not finished, because something about the woman in gray silk sitting alone had held his attention since she first walked through the saloon doors an hour ago. He was not a man given to staring, and he told himself twice to look away. He did not look away. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Otis Renwick, who had run the Silver Spur for 11 years and considered himself an expert on the private business of every soul who crossed his threshold, finally approached Mei Lin's table with the particular caution of a man who did not want to embarrass a paying customer. "Ma'am," he said, "can I bring you something more? You've had just the one tea, and that was a while back now." "I am still waiting," Mei Lin said, and her voice carried no tremor, though something in her chest had gone tight and cold. Perhaps he was delayed. Otis glanced toward the door, then back at her, and something in his expression told her he did not believe delay was the explanation, though he was too decent a man to say so outright. "Whatever you need, you just holler," he said, and moved off toward the bar. And Mei Lin was alone again, except for the sound of the piano and the low murmur of men playing cards near the window. It was Silas who spoke first, though he had not planned to. He had watched the exchange with the bartender, had watched her spine stay straight through every word of it, and something about that straightness undid whatever hesitation had been keeping him in his own chair. "Pardon me," he said, and Mei Lin turned, startled, because no one had addressed her directly all evening except the bartender. "I don't mean to intrude on your business, but it looks to me like whoever you're waiting on isn't coming, and I'd hate for you to sit here all night on the strength of a broken promise." Mei Lin studied him for a long moment. He was perhaps 35 years old, sun-weathered in the way of a man who spent his days outdoors, with a quiet steadiness in his gray eyes that she found, despite herself, easier to look at than she expected. "You are very forward for a stranger," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Name's Silas Whitcomb. I run a spread about 6 miles north of town. I don't usually interrupt a lady's evening, but I've been sitting here an hour watching that clock trouble you more than any clock ought to, and it didn't sit right with me to stay quiet." "His name is Bertram Voss," Mei Lin said, before she could decide whether she wanted to share it. "We corresponded through letters. He is a grain merchant from Abilene. He said he would be here at 7. Silas's jaw tightened slightly at the name, a reaction so brief she nearly missed it, but he said nothing about it, only nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "a man who lets a woman sit alone in a saloon for an hour and a half isn't a man worth losing sleep over. If you'll permit me, "I'd be glad to see you get a proper supper tonight, regardless of his manners." Mei Lin's first instinct was to decline. She had not survived 2 years alone on the frontier, first as a widow with a small dressmaking and laundry trade, then increasingly as a woman other townsfolk regarded with a particular narrow suspicion reserved for someone who looked different from everyone around her, by accepting kindness from strangers without understanding its cost. But something in Silas Whitcomb's manner, the way he had not moved from his own table, had not crowded her space, had simply offered and waited, made her hesitate before refusing. "I have money enough for my own supper," she said carefully. $5. I do not need charity." "Wasn't offering charity," Silas said. "Just company, if you'd have it. A meal tastes better shared, in my experience, even between strangers." Mei Lin looked toward the door one more time, and it remained empty, and something in her chest that had been holding rigid all evening finally allowed itself to loosen, just slightly. "All right," she said. "Company, then. But I will pay for my own meal, Mr. Whitcomb." "Wouldn't dream of arguing with a woman who's made her position clear," he said, and there was the ghost of a smile in it, and he rose and crossed to her table with his hat in hand, a gesture of respect that she noticed and filed away without comment. They ordered supper together, and the conversation that followed was slow and careful at first, the kind of talk that tests footing before committing weight to it. She learned that Silas had come west from Ohio a decade earlier, that his wife had died of childbed fever 4 years into their marriage, that he had built his ranch alone since, hiring hands for the seasons that demanded more labor than one man could provide. He learned that Mei Lin had come to Kansas with her husband, Wen Chin, who had worked the railroad crews outside Dodge City, and that after his death she had stayed rather than return east, because the small trade she had built taking in laundry and mending had become, against every expectation, a means of standing on her own feet. "That can't have been easy," Silas said. "A woman, alone, in a town like this?" "It has not been easy," Mei Lin agreed, "but it has been mine. I did not want to be a burden to anyone, and I did not want to depend on a man's charity to survive. So I found a trade that did not require his permission." Something flickered across Silas's face at that, something that looked almost like respect mixed with a private ache he did not explain, and Mei Lin noticed it and wondered at it, but did not press. They had nearly finished their meal, the conversation easing into something almost comfortable, when the saloon doors swung open and a man in a brown coat walked in, breathing hard as though he had hurried the last stretch of his approach, a folded newspaper tucked under one arm exactly as promised. Bertram Voss was younger than Mei Lin had pictured from his letters, with a soft, unweathered face and the kind of restless eyes that moved across a room cataloging who was watching before settling on anything else. He spotted Mei Lin at once, and his expression shifted through several things in quick succession before landing on something like practiced charm. "Miss Chin," he said, approaching the table, "my deepest apologies. Business detained me longer than expected." "You are 90 minutes late, Mr. Voss," Mei Lin said, and her voice was perfectly even. "Grain contracts do not keep polite hours," Voss said, and his eyes flicked to Silas with a faint, appraising displeasure. "I see you've found company in my absence." "I have," Mei Lin said. "Mr. Whitcomb was kind enough to see that I did not sit here alone until closing." Voss's smile thinned at the edges, though he kept it fixed in place. "Well," he said, "perhaps we might continue our evening now that I've arrived, if your new friend doesn't mind excusing us." Silas did not move from his chair, and something in his stillness carried more weight than any raised voice could have. "That's the lady's decision to make," he said, "not mine, and not yours to hurry her into." Mei Lin looked between the two men, and something about Voss's impatience, the way he had not once apologized directly for the wait, the way he seemed more concerned with reclaiming her attention than with any genuine remorse, crystallized a decision she had been circling all evening without quite naming it. "Mr. Voss," she said, rising from her chair with quiet dignity, "I do not think this arrangement suits either of us. I wish you well in finding a bride more patient than I am tonight." Voss's composure cracked for just a moment, something ugly flashing behind his eyes before he smoothed it back into practiced charm. "You'll regret this decision, Miss Chinn," he said, low enough that only she and Silas could hear it clearly. "Women in your position do not often get second offers." The words landed like a slap, and Maylin felt heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from anger, old and familiar, the particular sting of being reminded by a stranger exactly how the world had decided to categorize her. But before she could answer, Silas rose from his own chair, unhurried but unmistakably deliberate, and stepped between Voss and the table. "I think you've said your piece and worn out your welcome," Silas said. "Time you moved along." Voss looked at him for a long moment, weighing something, and whatever he saw in Silas's face convinced him the argument was not worth pursuing further. He straightened his coat with a sharp, wounded motion and walked out of the saloon without another word, and the doors swung shut behind him with a soft, final creak. The saloon had gone quiet around them, the kind of quiet that meant every ear in the room had heard at least part of the exchange, and Maylin felt the familiar weight of being watched settle over her shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. She sat back down slowly, her hands folded tight in her lap, and stared at the table. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly. "I have handled worse than Bertram Voss on my own." "I don't doubt it," Silas said, settling back into his own chair. "Doesn't mean you should have to, every time." They finished the meal in a different kind of silence than before, not uncomfortable exactly, but changed, weighted now with something neither of them had named. When Maylin reached for her handkerchief to pay her share, Silas set his hand lightly on the table near hers, not touching, but close enough to draw her attention. "I'd consider it a kindness if you'd let this one be on me," he said. "Not charity. Call it an apology on behalf of every fool in this town who's made your evenings harder than they needed to be." Maylin studied him for a long moment, and something in his steady gray eyes made her fold the $5 back into her sleeve rather than argue the point. "Thank you," she said simply, and it was enough. Word of what had happened in the Silver Spur moved through Whitfield the way word always moved through small towns, faster than any telegraph line, and by the following week Maylin found the whispers around her shop had taken a different, sharper tone. She had grown accustomed to a certain wary distance from the townsfolk, a politeness that never quite warmed into friendliness. But now there was an edge to it. Gossip dressed up as concern. Women who had never spoken to her directly suddenly finding reasons to comment on her business with Silas Whitcomb, as though it were public property. "They say he's taken a shine to you," said Dorothea Hargrove, who ran the town's only dress shop and had never once bought so much as a spool of thread from Maylin in 2 years, though she seemed to know a remarkable amount about Maylin's private affairs regardless. "Seems an odd match, if you don't mind my saying." "I do mind," Maylin said evenly, continuing to fold a stack of pressed lemons without looking up. "But I imagine you'll say it regardless." Dorothea's mouth pinched at that, and she left the shop without further comment, and Maylin allowed herself, once the door had closed, a single long breath before returning to her work. But Silas continued to appear. Not often. Not so often that it could be called courting outright, though Maylin suspected everyone in town had already decided that word applied, whether either of them used it or not. He would ride into town for supplies and stop by her shop to ask after her business, or find her at the general store and offer to carry her parcels the short distance home, Small gestures that cost him nothing, but somehow accumulated into something that felt, to Mei Lin, dangerously close to trust. It was on one such afternoon, 3 weeks after the evening in the saloon, that the real danger of the town's disapproval revealed itself in a form more concrete than gossip. Mei Lin arrived at her shop to find the front window shattered, glass scattered across the wooden floor, and painted crudely across the outer wall in tar. Words meant to drive her from Whitfield entirely. Words that made clear exactly what portion of the town resented a Chinese widow building any kind of life among them, let alone one that had begun, however quietly, to draw the attention of men like Silas Whitcomb. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hands trembling despite every effort to still them, and it was the marshal, a weathered man named Otto Reinhold, who had served the territory for 9 years and had little patience for cowardice dressed up as opinion, who found her there and surveyed the damage with a grim, tightening jaw. "I'll find out who did this," he said. "Whitfield's not so big a town that a man can break a window and vanish without a trace." "It will not matter if you find them," Mei Lin said quietly, sweeping glass with hands that had gone numb. "Finding them will not undo what they meant by it." Word reached Silas before the day was out, and he arrived at her shop in the evening light with his jaw set hard and something dangerous simmering behind his usual steadiness, a version of him Mei Lin had not seen before. "This is my fault," he said, surveying the broken glass, the ugly words still visible beneath a hasty attempt to scrub them away. "I should have been more careful about how I showed my regard for you in a town full of small minds." "It is not your fault," Mei Lin said, and there was iron in her voice now, the same iron that had carried her through 2 years of widowhood and suspicion and quiet, grinding loneliness. "It is the fault of whoever threw the rock, and no one else's. I will not have you carrying guilt for other men's cruelty." Silas looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, more careful. "I've been telling myself I was just being neighborly," he said, "bringing you supper, carrying your parcels, telling myself it didn't mean what it plainly means to everyone in this town, including, I suspect, you." Mei Lin's breath caught, and she set down the broom she had been holding, her hands finally still. "And what does it mean, Mr. Whitcomb?" "It means I think about you more than a man ought to think about a woman he's only spoken to a handful of times," Silas said, and the honesty in it seemed to cost him something, though he did not look away from her while he said it. "It means I rode into town today faster than I've ridden in years, because someone told me your window had been broken, and the thought of you standing here alone made something go cold in my chest that hasn't gone cold like that since my wife passed. I don't rightly know what to call that, except that it's more than neighborly." Mei Lin stood very still, the evening light slanting gold through the broken window behind her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I have spent 2 years making certain I did not need anyone," she said finally, her voice unsteady for the first time since he had known her. "It was safer that way, easier to bear whatever this town decided to think of me if I did not also have to fear losing something I had let myself want." "I'm not asking you to need me," Silas said. "I'm asking you to consider whether you might want to, even knowing what it could cost you in a town like this." The threat, however, had not finished revealing itself with a single broken window. 2 nights later, a fire was set deliberately along the back fence of Mei Lin's small property, catching dry summer grass and threatening the shed where she stored her dyes and fabric, before neighbors, roused by the smoke, managed to beat it back with wet blankets and buckets hauled from the well. Marshal Reinhold, Arriving as the last embers were doused, found a half-burned length of rope near the fence line, tied in a manner he recognized from his years dealing with men who preferred intimidation to open confrontation. This wasn't random mischief, he told Silas grimly, the two men standing over the damage in the gray pre-dawn light. Someone's decided to escalate. I've got my suspicions about who's behind the whispering that's been circling town since that business at the Silver Spur, but suspicion isn't proof, and I need proof before I can act. The suspicion, as it turned out, centered on Bertram Voss, whose wounded pride at being publicly refused had apparently curdled over 3 weeks into something considerably darker than embarrassment. Voss had remained in the region longer than his grain business required, and had been seen more than once in the company of a group of younger men known around Whitfield for rough behavior when liquor loosened their judgment. May Lynn, standing amid the charred remains of her back fence the morning after the fire, felt something in her that had been holding steady since Wynn's death finally began to crack. Perhaps he was right, she said quietly, to no one in particular, though Silas stood close enough to hear it. Perhaps I do not get a second chance at anything in this town, and I am foolish to keep trying to build one. You listen to me, Silas said, and there was a rare heat in his voice now, not directed at her, but at the circumstances pressing down on her. A coward with a grudge does not get to decide what you're owed in this life. You've built something here with your own 2 hands, and no amount of tar or fire changes the fact that it's yours. I won't let a man like Voss run you out of a town you've earned your place in. And if he does not stop at fires? May Lynn asked. Then he'll answer to more than the marshal, Silas said, and something in the flatness of his tone told her he meant it in the fullest sense the frontier allowed. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on a hot, still evening 10 days later, when Voss and 3 of his companions rode out to May Lynn's small property under cover of dusk, apparently emboldened by liquor and the belief that a widow living alone, even one now under Silas Whitcomb's evident protection, would offer little resistance to a final, decisive act of intimidation. May Lynn heard the horses before she saw them, and something in the rhythm of the hoofbeats, too many riders approaching too fast for any innocent purpose, sent her moving instantly toward the small pistol her late husband had left her, a weapon she had never fired outside of practice, but had kept loaded and close since the fire. She was standing in her doorway, the pistol steady in her hand, though her heart hammered against her ribs, when Voss and his companions reined up in her yard, torches lit despite the lingering summer heat, their intent unmistakable in the flickering light. "Should have taken the hen after the fire, Miss Chin," Voss called out, his voice slurred with drink and old resentment. "This town doesn't want you. Never did. Best you understand that before something worse than a fence burns." "You will turn those horses around and leave my property," May Lynn said, her voice carrying steady across the yard despite the tremor in her hands, "or I will put a bullet through the first man who dismounts." One of Voss's companions laughed, a short, ugly sound, and began to swing down from his horse, testing her resolve, and May Lynn's finger tightened on the trigger with a certainty that surprised even herself, a readiness born of 2 years spent learning that no one else would defend the ground she stood on if she did not defend it first. But before the man's boots touched the dirt, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from the road behind them, and Silas Whitcomb rode into the yard at a hard gallop, a rifle already braced across his saddle, his face carved from the same grim stone May Lynn had glimpsed only once before, the night of the fire. "That's far enough," Silas said, reining his horse hard between Voss's group and the house, the rifle now level and steady. "You've got exactly one chance to ride out of here, and I'd think carefully before you decide it isn't a good one." Voss's bravado, fueled mostly by drink and the assumption of easy intimidation, faltered visibly in the face of an armed man who showed no hesitation whatsoever. "This isn't your fight, Whitcomb," he said, though the certainty had drained from his voice. "Made it my fight the day you spoke to her the way you did in that saloon," Silas said, "and it became a matter for the marshal the day you set fire to her fence, which means you've got two choices left in this world, Voss. Ride out now, or explain yourself to Marshal Reinhold in the morning, assuming you're still upright enough to talk by then." The standoff held for a long, taut moment, torchlight flickering across tense faces, and it was Mei Lin, still standing in her doorway with the pistol steady in her hand, who broke the silence with a calm that seemed to unsettle Voss more than any shouted threat could have. "I have already lost a husband to this territory, Mr. Voss," she said. "I did not survive that loss and everything after it, to be frightened off my own land by a man too proud to accept a simple refusal. Leave now, or I promise you, between the two of us, you will regret staying." Something in the combined weight of her steadiness and Silas's leveled rifle finally broke through Voss's drunken resolve, and after a long, ugly moment of hesitation, he wheeled his horse around, muttering something bitter under his breath, and his companions followed, torches bobbing away into the darkness, until the sound of hooves faded entirely, and the yard fell quiet except for the ragged sound of Mei Lin's own breathing. Silas dismounted and crossed to her quickly, and she lowered the pistol with hands that had finally begun to shake now that the danger had passed, and he did not reach for her, only stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cooling night air. "You didn't need me tonight," he said quietly. "You'd have handled him fine on your own." "Perhaps," Mei Lin said, "but I am glad you came anyway." Marshal Reinhold arrested Voss and his companions before noon the following day, gathering enough witness testimony from townsfolk who had finally grown tired of watching a decent woman terrorized to build a case that even Voss's family connections in Abilene could not entirely smooth over. Voss left the territory within the month, his grain business reputation sufficiently damaged that he found little welcome anywhere in the region afterward, and the two young men who had ridden with him faced enough of Marshal Reinhold's particular brand of frontier justice that neither troubled Mei Lin again. The town's whispering did not vanish entirely, because towns rarely surrender their gossip so easily, but something in the aftermath of that night shifted the balance of Whitfield's opinion in Mei Lin's favor, or at least loosened its grip enough that she found herself, in the weeks that followed, treated with a wary respect she had not known since arriving in Kansas. 3 months passed, the summer heat finally breaking into the cooler edge of autumn, and Mei Lin's small shop had grown busier than it had ever been, several of the very women who had once whispered about her now bringing their finest linens for her careful hand, drawn as much by curiosity about the woman who had stood her ground against Bertram Voss as by any genuine change of heart, though Mei Lin found she cared less about their motives than about the steady, growing income that finally let her set aside savings beyond mere survival. Silas rode into town most weeks now, no longer bothering to disguise the visits as anything but courtship, and the two of them had settled into an easy rhythm of shared suppers and long, quiet conversations on her small porch as the evening cooled, conversations that ranged from cattle prices to the small griefs of losses long past, each of them slowly, carefully, learning the shape of the other's private sorrows. It was on an evening in late September, the two of them sitting together on her porch steps with the last light fading gold over the Kansas plains, that Silas finally set down the cup of tea she had made him and turned to face her directly. "I've been thinking on something for a while now," he said, "and I reckon I've waited long enough to say it plain, rather than let you guess at it through carried parcels and Sunday suppers." Maylin set down her own cup, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. "Say it then." "I'd be honored if you'd consider marrying me," Silas said, the words steady despite the visible nervousness beneath them. "Not because this town would find it tidier, and not out of pity for anything you've weathered. Because I've come to care for you more deeply than I expected to care for anyone again in this life, and because I think, if you'll have me, we could build something together worth more than either of us has managed alone." Maylin looked at him for a long moment, the man who had stepped between her and a room full of judgment on the strength of a single evening's acquaintance, who had ridden hard through darkness because the thought of her standing alone against danger had unsettled something in his chest he hadn't felt in years, and she thought of the $5 still folded carefully in a drawer inside her shop, money she had once considered the full measure of what she could offer an evening, and understood now how far she had traveled since that night in the Silver Spur. "I have spent 2 years believing I did not need anyone to survive this territory," she said quietly.
"I still believe that, Silas. I do not need you to survive."
Something flickered across his face, a brief shadow of doubt, before she continued. "But I have decided," she said, reaching for his weathered hand and holding it steady in both of hers, "that surviving alone was never the same as living well. I would be glad to marry you, not because I need saving, but because I want, for the first time since Wynn died, to build a life alongside someone, rather than merely enduring one by myself." Silas's answering smile was slow and unguarded, the smile of a man who had not expected, after years of quiet, solitary grief, to find himself offered this particular kind of second chance, and he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a gentleness that told her everything his careful words had not quite managed to say. They married in October, in a small ceremony at the Whitfield church that drew, to Maylin's genuine surprise, a respectable gathering of townsfolk, including Dorothea Hargrove, who brought a length of fine blue silk as a wedding gift, and offered no comment whatsoever on the oddness of the match, a silence Maylin chose to accept as its own quiet form of apology. Maylin kept her shop running, now with the added security of Silas's ranch behind her, and within a year her trade had grown steady enough that she took on a young apprentice to help manage the workload, an arrangement that would have seemed impossible to the woman who had once folded 5 careful dollars into her sleeve and hoped for nothing more than a decent supper alone. On quiet evenings, sitting together on the porch of the ranch house Silas had built with his own hands a decade before, Maylin would sometimes think back to that night in the Silver Spur, the clock ticking past 7, then past 8, the particular loneliness of waiting for someone who never intended to arrive. She had learned in the years since that sometimes the life a person is waiting for is not the one that walks through the expected door at the expected hour, but the one sitting quietly at the next table, watching, willing to offer nothing more than honest company, until honest company became something neither of them could imagine living without. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.